Hi, everyone. This is your People Behind the Science podcast host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and it is another perfect day for chatting about life and science with a great guest. I am excited to have you here with us for episode 791 of the show with Dr. Michael Middlebrooks. If you've been enjoying People Behind the Science, we would be really grateful if you could share our show with a friend or tell the world what you think about our show with a review on your favorite podcast platform. And we have another great conversation on the way from today's guest. So get ready to meet another one of our phenomenal people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest researcher, Dr. Michael Middlebrooks. So, Michael, welcome to the show today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Well, we are so excited to have you with us, and I'm looking forward to learning more about you and the exciting research that you're doing. But first, let me take a moment to tell our listeners a little bit more about you and how you got to where you are today. So listeners, Michael is an associate professor of biology at the University of Tampa. He received his bachelor's degree in biology from Florida State University and his Ph.D. in integrative biology from the University of South Florida. Michael remained at the University of South Florida to conduct postdoctoral research before joining the faculty there at the University of Tampa. He was awarded the Outstanding Faculty Advisor Award from the University of Tampa, as well as the university's Outstanding Student Research Supervisor Award from the College of Natural and Health Sciences there. And today, Michael, we're excited to get to know you as a scientist, of course, but also as a person. So can you tell us, what do you like to do when you're not doing science?
All right. Well, I have kind of a very bad work-life balance. My favorite thing to do on the entire planet is scuba diving. That is also something that I do for work. And so there's a lot of that blended together. I really enjoy spending time underwater looking for weird animals. In addition to that, I also really like music. So I particularly like live music. So I do enjoy going out to see bands play quite a bit. I also like reading.
Well, Michael, it's wonderful to hear more about your life outside the lab. And I think for a lot of scientists, they're working on things they're really passionate about. So you do see that blend of business and your leisure activities. But let's talk about books. You mentioned you're a fan of reading. We love sharing book recommendations on the show. So do you have a favorite book that you like to recommend for everyone out there, whether it's related to science or not?
Yeah, I'm definitely not going to recommend science books.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little better about reading for leisure than I am with some of my other activities. So I do tend to mostly read things when I'm not reading scientific papers. I read things for fun. So I really like to read science fiction. I really like mysteries. A couple of recommendations for just books that I've read over the past few years that I really liked. Kind of been reading some stuff lately, which is like climate change disaster books, which is not a very happy subject. But I read one a year or two ago, which was sort of the opposite end of that, called A Ministry for the Future. And that was a really excellent book. I also read during the pandemic, I read a really fun book that was about music and a pandemic and being stuck inside and the sort of the end of live music, called A Song for a New Day. That's one of my favorite books I've ever read. And one book that I think is just really fun and very silly science fiction that I've really been enjoying the series is called Dungeon Crawler Carl. It's very stupid, but it makes me laugh a lot. I really like it.
I think that's awesome. Well, we will add these 3 books to our website for our listeners to find: A Ministry for the Future, A Song for a New Day, and Dungeon Crawler Carl. That's a little bit of everything. I like it. And now we've touched on your life outside of science. You mentioned that there's some overlap between your passions. So let's talk about your scientific side. How do you describe what you do to someone who is not in your specific field or perhaps is outside of science altogether?
I do a number of different things in my research program. Primarily, though, the main thing that I work on is sea slugs. So sea slugs are a group of animals that are basically snails that over the course of evolution have lost their shell. And I work on quite a variety of different species of sea slugs, and there are lots and lots of them. They're incredibly diverse, and we know very little about most of them. But the group that I work on most commonly are called the Sacaglossan sea slugs. they're a really neat group of animals. They are herbivores, so they feed on algae in the ocean. And they're very specialist feeders. A lot of them, not all of them, but many of them will only eat one particular species of algae. So it's a very close ecological relationship. I like studying those sort of plant-animal interactions. Some of the sea slugs that I study, some of the Sacaglossans, have a unique twist to them, though. So they don't actually necessarily feed all that often. And what they'll do is they take the chloroplasts, which are the organelles inside of the algae cells that let them photosynthesize or make energy from the sunlight. And they take those chloroplasts, and instead of digesting them, the sea slugs will put them inside of special cells in their own body. And then the sea slugs are able to photosynthesize. And that's a lot of what I study, is how being a photosynthetic animal can change your ecology, change your interaction with the other organisms in the ecosystem around you. I think it's really interesting and bizarre and strange and fun. So that's a lot of what I work on. I also do a little bit of seagrass restoration work, although that is also mostly in the context of plant-animal interactions.
Very cool. Well, Michael, I think these photosynthetic sea slugs are absolutely amazing. I think sea slugs in general are gorgeous. If listeners haven't seen pictures of them, could you maybe paint a picture of the diversity or the variety of these sea slugs that you see?
It really is something you need to look at photos or ideally videos of if you don't have an opportunity to see them alive. There is an absolute rainbow of colors of sea slugs, particularly the nudibranch sea slugs, which are another group that I also do a little bit of work with, not as much as the Sacaglossans, but they just come in a ridiculous variety of beautiful colors. They'll have strange appendages coming off of their body. And if you're imagining some gross, slimy thing in your garden, the sea slug is sort of the opposite. I will admit they are also rather slimy if you touch them, but you shouldn't touch them generally anyways. I tend not to like that. But they're just beautiful, and there's so much variety and diversity within them. So yeah, I highly recommend you just look it up and find out what some look like, because they are spectacular.
And I think being able to study such cool creatures can be inherently motivating, but we love talking about motivation and inspiration on the show. So do you have a favorite quote or a saying or something, Michael, that just keeps you motivated to go in every day?
I'm not a big motivational quote kind of guy. When I'm asked for a quote, I'm going to have to paraphrase one because I don't have anything memorized. But my favorite sort of thing would come from author Terry Pratchett, who died a few years ago, but he's an English author, wrote the Discworld series and a number of other books. And in one of the books, again, I'm going to paraphrase this, though. He said, basically, one of his characters said that tradition is letting yourself be outvoted by the dead. And I quite like that as sort of a just general idea of examining the reason why you're doing something. So are we doing this because everybody did it before, or are we doing it because it still makes sense?
I love that. And I think that really showcases kind of the probing nature of scientists, the curiosity, the wanting to question everything, which I think can be really helpful as a scientist, not taking things for granted and just continuing to do things the same way that people always have.
Yeah, and certainly there's value in learning from what people have done before, but you don't have to do the exact same thing just because it's been done that way. I think it's always worth examining and questioning that.
Definitely. And I think as a scientist, you get to work with some remarkable people, and these people might motivate you to ultimately pursue a career in science. So when you look back over your path, Michael, are there particular role models or maybe even just inspirational figures that you looked up to that really had a big impact on you and your career?
I'm a little bit of an anti-hero, anti-role model person, just because I don't like putting people up on unrealistic pedestals with unrealistic expectations. All of these people you work with or who might inspire you or do great things are all still people. And I think keeping that in mind gives you more realistic interactions and expectations with them. That said, I've had the pleasure of working with some fantastic people who were mentors for me over my life and over my career. So just real briefly, I'll start with my parents. They were always very supportive of me. And one of the things I've always enjoyed, and even as a young child, was spending time outdoors, exploring and looking at nature and just observing and seeing things. I think that's really one of the things that inspired me to become a biologist. I had a really excellent middle school science teacher. His name was Glenn Cole, and I had him for all 3 years of middle school, and he taught me so much. He was such a good teacher, and I learned so much, and it was so enthusiastic that really had a big impact on me as well. In college, I had some excellent professors. Most notably for me was Bill Hernkind at the Florida State University. He was my invertebrate zoology professor, and that's ultimately what I went into. He helped set me up with my first science job, which was with Dr. Mark Butler, who was at Old Dominion University at the time. He does lobster research, very cool stuff. And he was also a very good mentor for me. And then my professors in graduate school, my major professor was Dr. Susan Bell, and she is a real pioneer in landscape ecology, did some really amazing work. And I also did my postdoc with Dr. Skip Pierce, also at the University of South Florida. And he was great to work with. I learned a lot from him as well. So I've been very fortunate with the mentors that I've had.
Oh, definitely. And I think those early teachers and mentors can really help you see how these interests that you might have in biology could be transformed into a career. So perhaps we'll walk back all the way to the beginning. You mentioned that you were already starting to get interested in observing the outside world. Your parents were supportive. When did you start thinking about science as a career?
Later. I always liked science, and I always really liked engaging with nature. I got scuba certified when I was 15. My dad got my sister and I certified then, and I still dive with him.
Oh, cool.
We do at least one big scuba trip every year. So that was a big part of that, as well as just getting to be underwater and seeing all of those things. So in high school, I didn't really think that I was going to go into a science career. I was on the school newspaper and I really enjoyed that and journalism. And so I initially went to college to study journalism. And then as I started to learn more about what that career would look like, I decided that was not for me and instead looked at my other major interest, which was biology. So I switched to a biology major after that. So I did spend a bit longer in undergrad than I might have otherwise.
Oh, that makes sense. And then what really sealed the deal for you? So you thought, okay, well, maybe we'll do this career in biology thing instead. What was that moment where you're like, this is it?
I don't know that I was ever that forward thinking about this as a long-term thing. It was sort of like one step at a time, and I just kept enjoying what I was doing. So I would do what came next, and it just kept being enjoyable and really good. And ultimately, it was a good choice because I'm not suitable probably for real-world jobs. I think academia and science are really what I'm best cut out for. But it wasn't necessarily planning for a great future doing this. It was just following the path as it emerged to me. So it was kind of exploration and a bit of blind luck.
Definitely. And I love to hear that you didn't have that whole path planned out from the very beginning. I think that's helpful for people out there who might be considering careers in science, but maybe feeling like they're already behind. So I think that's really helpful for listeners to understand what got you on this path. But then what were some of the key moments you think that really helped you get to where you are today on the faculty at the University of Tampa?
There's a number of factors that are involved in this, and part of it is just good fortune. My career expertise is really in invertebrate zoology. And at the time when I was ready to look for jobs, many of the invertebrate zoologists in universities around the country were at retirement age. So it was just a lucky timing for me. But another factor in when I was looking for jobs was the type of job that I wanted to find in science. So within marine biology, there's a wide number of careers that you can actually have. I knew I wanted to go at an academic route, but even within that, there's a good variety of options. And one of the things that I learned in graduate school was that I really enjoyed teaching. And so part of that came from another mentor, which I didn't mention, USF Dr. Chris Osowitz, who was my supervisor when I was a teaching assistant there. And he really helped me understand the passion that he had for teaching. And I found that engaging, and I really caught on with that too. So I really enjoyed teaching and sharing all of this amazing components of nature, particularly invertebrate animals, with students. So I started looking for a job that had a significant teaching component. And there's some trade-offs with that. Being at a university that's teaching focused, there's not as much funding available for research. There's not as much time necessarily available for research because teaching is a large part of my job. But because of that, the expectations for research are also a little bit different. So since I'm not expected to bring in millions and millions of dollars in grant money, I can focus on whatever I'd like. And since we know so little about sea slugs, we can learn a lot of things that are brand new to science for comparatively little funding.
I think that's wonderful. It sounds like you found a position that is a perfect fit for you. And I know you're doing some cool research. So I'd love to dive into some of the details. Michael, is there a particular project that you are working on at the moment that you are just the most excited about and want to share with us today?
So I mentioned before how I work on these photosynthetic sea slugs, and most of them are very picky about their diet. But there's a few of them that have a broader diet. So the species that I work with is called Alicia crispata. Sometimes the common name for it is the lettuce sea slug. And this animal lives all across the Caribbean, all the way up to the Florida Keys. And I mostly work on populations in the Florida Keys, but sometimes other places in the Caribbean as well. And one of the things that I'm interested in is these interactions between herbivores and their food sources. So these plant-animal interactions. And with Elysia crispata, there's some older literature that suggested that we go out into the wild, we find these animals sitting on these particular types of algae. This is what they're eating, which logically makes sense. But what we've learned is that for this animal, that's not true. So you can go out and see an animal sitting on some algae, and that doesn't tell you necessarily anything except that it's currently sitting there. Because they're photosynthesizing, right? They're making most of their own food, so they're not necessarily having to go and eat. And one of the things that we do to determine what they've actually been eating is we use molecular techniques. So we use what's called DNA barcoding. And basically we can take a piece of slug tissue and identify the DNA of the chloroplasts that it's sequestered and use that to sort of reconstruct its diet. So it's sort of like a dietary forensics almost. And we've been doing that for many years now, but we've had some major advances in molecular techniques. And so now we're using genomic DNA and getting even better resolution on what these animals are eating. And it's a much, much wider diet than we thought was possible. Basically, when I go out and do these field surveys to look at the algae that might be part of their diet, mostly I'm missing them. You can't find what they're feeding on visually because it's these very tiny little filamentous algae in many cases. And what's also exciting about it is a lot of these species of algae, while we can identify them to a group, the species has likely not been described for those algae either. So there's a lot of unknown stuff here, which I always find very exciting.
Oh, that's really cool. So do you think these sea slugs are sort of purposefully specialists with their diets, or is it more like an opportunist sort of thing where they're just eating what happens to be in front of them?
I think most of them have evolved to be specialist feeders. And in the laboratory, if you give a slug something that it is not part of its diet, it will not feed on it. So they don't recognize that stuff as food. So that is part of their natural history. Part of their evolutionary history is this specialization. Likely, there's sort of a coevolution between the algae and the sea slugs that occurs over time. One thing that I did not mention, which is also rather interesting, is that a lot of these algae are chemically defended. Not all of them, but many of them are. And so they don't actually have that many herbivores that can feed on them. So the sea slugs are sort of the only group that really specializes on many of these species of algae. So it can often be a very tight relationship between them. So for many of these smaller sea slugs, if I want to find them, what I do is I go into the field, I collect the algae that they feed on, and then I sort through the algae in the lab until I find the tiny slugs.
That makes sense. Well, I think this is really cool research, and I think you're making it sound easy. You just go out in the wild, find these algae, find these sea slugs. And I think science isn't always easy. And oftentimes people only see the end products, the success stories, and they don't hear about the struggles, the failure, the challenges that go along with it. So, Michael, do you have an example of a time that you really struggled with something, or perhaps you had a major failure? And if so, could you walk us through how you got through that tough time?
I think that there's probably more failures than successes along the way. Mm-hmm. I can think of many examples, and they all eventually work out with enough perseverance. But there are days where you're just like, oh, why am I doing this when it all goes wrong? One I remember in particular in graduate school, I was doing a behavioral experiment with some of the sea slugs, and I needed to get them into the right conditions. And to do that, it took about 3 months of raising them in the laboratory to get them to where I needed them to be. And then there was a critical day at that 3-month point where I had to collect all this data. And I got there, had the animals in the right condition, went to go do it, and just everything completely failed. So I was trying to use an oxygen probe to measure, basically as a proxy for measuring their photosynthetic rates. And what I did not realize is that sea slugs do produce a lot of mucus. I did mention they're a bit slimy, and they completely slimed up the probe, so I couldn't actually measure anything in the container. So it was just 3 months of work completely gone. So I started again, and I went and did it again, and then the same thing happened. So that's 6 months there, completely wasted with nothing to show for it. So I set out to do it a third time, and I found a new technique to measure photosynthesis. So a different proxy mechanism for doing it, and then it worked. So that was good. I had a student project a couple years ago. So we've got at the University of Tampa, we have some really excellent internal support for student research projects. We have a really good Office of Undergraduate Research and Inquiry that funds student researchers. And so I was working with a student on this summer project, and we had a really good project design. She worked with me, and we were very deliberate about coming up with this project that we were both very, very excited about. And when Daniela, my student, and I went out to go collect the slugs, we couldn't find any of them. And this is normally a slug that's so common it's almost a pest. And just that summer, there were none. So we went and found a different slug and ran a similar experiment, and it ended up being great. And we published the paper last year with her as the first author on it, which was very exciting.
Oh, absolutely. I think this really highlights that this flexibility is important and being able to pivot when things don't go right. And I'm curious, after sort of that string of failures in graduate school, how did you recover? What made you pick back up and say, all right, I need to find a new way to do this rather than just giving up on the project altogether?
Well, during the day of failure, giving up on the project definitely seems like a viable option. There's something about a problem and coming up with solutions that is quite satisfying. So I do like a challenge, and experimental design and figuring out how to answer these questions that occur to you when you're looking at an organism or a natural system is part of the fun. It's part of the challenge. It's a bit of a puzzle, and I enjoy picking that apart and trying things and figuring out what works. And sometimes your initial ideas fail. I've learned now to, when I can, particularly if I'm working in sort of an animal behavior kind of realm, to do some trial experiments first, because animals often don't behave the way you expect them to or want them to. And so you have to design things carefully, and some preliminary experiments really go a long way.
Definitely. And you had mentioned previously that ultimately you're able to turn a lot of these challenges or difficult times into successes. And I think it's so important to celebrate these successes in science because there is often a long road to get there. So do you have a favorite success story, Michael, from your research, whether it was a big win or even just a small but meaningful victory that you'd like to share with us today?
I'm going to tell you one that's a fairly recent scientific publication that we had that came out of a challenging time. So during COVID, we had a lot of limitations on what we were able to do, and working with students was very difficult. So during that time, I got together a group of students to meet over Zoom, and we would discuss scientific papers. And from that, we basically just started working over Zoom, and we would read a scientific paper and then discuss it as a group. And out of that group, and coming from that and some new projects, a new lab activity that I was developing for my teaching lab, we developed a research project where we were sampling a population of sea slugs that lives on hydroids, which are little colonial animals kind of related to sea anemones and jellyfish, although not that closely related to them, but they're in that same broad group of cnidarians. So we did a year-long population study of that eventually once the lockdown ended, and we could start doing field sampling and working in the lab again. And it was a really big project, lots of student hours, lots of time on the microscope looking for these tiny slugs. But it was just a really fun study, and we learned a lot about it. And I got a lot of students involved. So that was a really big, exciting thing that came out of a difficult time.
Well, it's wonderful that you were able to turn this difficult time during COVID into what sounds like a really vibrant, dynamic, exciting project that was a great opportunity for the students working on it. So how did you celebrate once this project got off the ground and the amazing data started rolling in?
Well, I'm kind of the mindset that you don't celebrate a scientific project until the paper is published, because I don't feel like it counts as science until it's out there and shared and available. So if you just collect data and keep it to yourself, it's interesting and might be enjoyable, but it's not science, right? The second and really important step to science is communicating that and making that available for the scientific community. So really our celebration came when the paper came out.
Fantastic. Well, I'm a big fan, of course, of science communication, so this is a priority for me as well. So how did you celebrate when the paper came out?
Well, we had at the end of last year, I had all the students over to my house, and we had a little end of the year party to celebrate the paper, celebrate the students who were graduating, and celebrate all of the good things that we had happened to us over that year. So we made some tacos and had everybody over to just celebrate. One of my students made a very silly slug cake, which was fun.
I think that sounds absolutely amazing. And I'm so glad to hear that you did take a moment to kind of recognize the efforts of all of these students that went into this big project and celebrate that milestone of the paper coming out. And I think as a scientist, maybe particularly as a scientist who does a little bit of field research going out there in the world to collect these sea slugs, one of the great things is you get to do a lot of travel, whether it is field work or whether you're going to conferences. So, Michael, do you have a favorite place that you've traveled to for science?
I really, really like traveling. I have been very fortunate in that I've gotten to travel to a lot of really interesting destinations, both for science and for personal enrichment, particularly for scuba diving. For research projects, probably the most exciting place that I got to visit for actually making field collections was probably the dry tortugas. which is at the end of the Florida Keys. It's the islands sort of continue out there. And that was very exciting because we ended up having to take a seaplane out to go make the collections. So that was a bit different than normal. But for not necessarily research collection, but just enjoying the fantastic underwater scenery and wildlife, I think my favorite places are in the Coral Triangle. So Indonesia and then the Philippines are my favorite places to visit just because the wildlife there is so fantastic and the diversity of marine animals is tremendous.
I love it. So what is maybe the coolest thing that you've been able to see while out there scuba diving?
That's a really difficult question to answer because there's just so much interesting and strange things to see in the wild. So the last time I went to the Philippines, I got to see a number of very rare sea slugs, which was very exciting. Some nudibranchs that I had never seen before. So anytime I can see something brand new, it's really, really fun. So any kind of time I get to sit underwater or just sort of hover there right above the seafloor and observe some interesting animal behavior is always lots of fun. I've had a few opportunities to see some really interesting behavior from some cephalopods. So like see some cuttlefish hunting, things like that. Some octopus hunting is very interesting. One time I was in the Sea of Cortez in Mexico and I was in this little overhang looking at a really beautiful nudibranch sea slug, just really vibrant colors colorable at the bottom. And one of the other residents in the Sea of Cortez are sea lions, and a big group of sea lions zoomed into where I was and started just doing flips and fighting with each other. And they started picking starfish up off the bottom and using them as toys. That was a really funny interaction to see.
Well, I think that is absolutely remarkable. And it sounds like you've been able to do quite a lot of traveling, both for science as well as for your hobbies. We'll call it nature observations. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity as part of a career in science. But another great thing about these careers are the people that you get to work with. You've highlighted some of your students, some of your mentors along the way. And I think oftentimes in the media, scientists are portrayed a certain way, but when you meet these people in real life, they do not meet the stereotype. There are so many funny, amazing, creative people in science. So do you have examples of some of these human moments in science that highlight some of these different features, whether it's quirky traditions or just fun or funny moments that you've shared with colleagues that maybe go against the stereotypes people may have?
One of the things that my students and I do in the lab is that we make slug memes. So often taking memes from pop culture and then changing them into memes about sea slugs. So the lab is decorated with a bunch of memes where sea slugs have been replaced for famous people, or sometimes they'll take lab members' heads and put them over onto a sea slug and things like that. So we have a lot of silly stuff like that in the lab.
I love that. The sense of humor is amazing. So how did this tradition get started?
I think I probably have to credit my student, Julia, with that. If she wasn't the innovator of us doing that, she was definitely the one who pushed it forward the most. But I think we started doing it during COVID and we just text each other some of the slug memes that we make. And one of the big projects that I have going on is just sort of a continuous ongoing thing that may never end is I'm trying to document all of the different species of sea slugs we have in Tampa Bay. So I'll often text them a picture when I find a new species we hadn't seen in the area before that will sometimes get used to build a meme or something like that. That's probably how that started.
Well, I love that. And I love that this is sort of an example then of the fact that people who come through the lab can really shape the culture of the group over the years. And I think this is a fun way to showcase the sense of humor and to just make it a little bit more fun and enjoyable to be in the lab on those long days, because you're tackling some difficult questions in science. And I know, like you mentioned, funding can often be a challenge, as well as just staff, technology, time, feasibility, you name it. So if we took away the barriers, Michael, is there one research question that you would want to answer most if you had unlimited resources?
I'm going to give you two answers. One of them is the big question that people who work on Sacaglossan sea slugs, and there are a lot of brilliant people working on these organisms all over the world. The question is, how are they able to keep these chloroplasts alive and photosynthesizing? If you remove a chloroplast from a plant or algae cell, it does not last very long. And the chloroplast itself has genetic material, but it's fairly small and really relies on the nucleus of the algal or plant cell to keep it functioning. So we really don't know how these sea slugs are able to do that. That's sort of the big question, is how do they manage that? The other question that bothers me from time to time, which is probably the least important question of all the ones that I wonder about, is sometimes some of my lettuce sea slugs, the Alicia crispata, Some of the individuals are blue, and I would really like to know why they're blue.
Interesting. Are there any hints thus far, or is it kind of a wide open question?
So I thought that we would maybe be able to get at it through diet. So they're usually varying shades of green. And if they eat different algae, it changes the shade of green that they present. So basically, because the different chloroplasts have different pigments in them. And so some will be quite dark and some of them will be more of a greenish yellow kind of color, and a wide range of palette between that. But some of them are just this brilliant blue. And so far, when we've identified the diet of those blue animals, there's no pattern. There's nothing different about it than the ones that are green.
Well, Michael, I think you've given us some marvelous questions to ponder today. And I'd love to wrap up our conversation by talking about advice. So for our listeners out there who are in need of advice, is there one piece that somebody gave you at some point along your life or your career that you can share with them today that might help them out?
I think the best piece of advice that I can give, and I don't know that I was necessarily given this as a direct piece of advice, but more by example than anything else, is to embrace perseverance. And it's important not to give up when things aren't going the way you expect. That doesn't mean to beat your head into the same solution over and over again if it's not working, but try to look at things a different way and see what else you can come up with. And science and everything is a skill set, and it's something that grows over time. The first time I went out to go collect sea slugs, I spent hours in this habitat that literally had thousands of individual sea slugs living in it. And after all of that time, I came out with 3 flatworms and no sea slugs because I hadn't learned how to collect them yet. I hadn't learned how to see them yet. So that's part of it, is developing the skills. In my case, it was developing the eye for seeing these animals in the wild. And they're often quite camouflaged. So you have to start just being observant and taking the time and moving slowly. And I think observation and patience really goes a long way when working in natural systems. That same habitat, again, is sort of an example in looking at things a different way. A number of years ago, we had a hurricane come through the Florida Keys, which is where that area was, Hurricane Irma, and it devastated the Florida Keys, but also completely wiped out that sea slug habitat, which was pretty upsetting for me and my colleagues working on it. But we had a bit of a silver lining with that, right? That population never recovered, but we were able to write a research paper about the hurricane's impacts on the slugs. So I did that with my colleague Nick Curtis and Skip Pierce, who I mentioned before. So we were able to write an interesting paper about how the hurricane impacted that slug population.
Definitely. And I think that highlights just the ability to find opportunities in difficult situations. And I think that can be really important in science, particularly, like you said, when working on these natural systems. Well, Michael, we appreciate you sharing these examples from your own life and experiences. Is there any other last piece of advice or maybe a last note of inspiration that you'd like to leave all of our listeners with at the end of our interview today?
One thing that I think is really valuable for anybody, but biologists in particular, spend more time in nature. Most of the ideas that I get for experiments come from spending time in nature and observing animals in their natural habitat. And I think seeing things in that context is really important, and it's really valuable for everybody, whether you're a biologist or not. Just having that sort of experience is really valuable and really enjoyable. So I recommend spend more time outside, spend more time in nature if you can.
Well, I love that advice, listeners. Definitely make sure to get outside today. Take a break from all the screens and the computers. And Michael, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you. If our listeners would like to learn more about you and the work that you do, what is a good way for them to do so?
If you want to learn more about this, I did have a TED Talk come out a few years ago. So if you search my name, Michael Middlebrooks TED Talk, or on the TED website, you can see it, learn a little bit more about the sea slugs. I have a Instagram account for my research lab. It's UTampa Slug Life at Instagram. I'm also on Blue Sky. You can search my name, Michael Middlebrooks, on Blue Sky, or I think the handle is Secret Slug Lab at Blue Sky, and find me there. I want to mention one more thing. We're recording this on October 29th, 2024. And October 29th, as everyone obviously knows, is International Sea Slug Day. So happy Sea Slug Day, everyone.
Well, I had no idea. How fortuitous. Well, Michael, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy Sea Slug Day to spend with us for this interview. Listeners, definitely get connected, learn more about the amazing work that Michael is doing. And Michael, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Well, Michael, thanks again. And listeners, thank you for joining us as well. We hope to see you again next time for another episode of People Behind the Science.